and that kind of stuff.
Ils faisaient notre fierté, ils font la fierté.
They were very proud, you know.
Les gens se sentent unis, appartenir à une tribu qui est forte, qui a vaincu des guerres.
And the people had a feeling they were from a tribe that has won all the wars, and very, very proud.
Mais aujourd'hui, on est devant de nouveaux défis qui sont plus juste se plaire de son histoire.
But nowadays they are in front of a lot of different challenges. It's not only about their own glory and that kind of.
On est face à des difficultés de la vie quotidienne, face à l'autorité, face aux problèmes de loi, comme on en parle ici.
They are in front of difficulties of life, daily life, with all the political events that happen in their country too.
Les artistes, en fait, sont considérés comme des sortes d'éternels révoltés qui se révoltent contre l'autorité, même contre l'autorité de la loi.
Yeah, and artists are always seen as being in rebellion against the law, against all kinds of authorities.
Parce que la façon dont la loi est créée chez nous, dans la Constitution, s'impose, honnêtement, il y a très souvent très peu d'adhésion de la majorité de la population.
Because the way they make law in their country makes that there is a very little adherence to the kind of law they pass.
La Constitution du Mali, quand tu la vois et tu regardes la Constitution française, souvent, même les articles, l'article 5 parle du pouvoir du président dans la Constitution française, l'article 5 de la Constitution malienne parle du pouvoir du président, l'article 12 parle des relations internationales et l'autre, même les articles, les articles éléments.
So they have articles in the Constitution, for instance, when you take Article 5 and Article 5 of the French Constitution, the Constitution of Mali, they're about the same, 11 is the same. They took it over, I mean, it has nothing to do with their own population.
Mexico would have the same.
Donc,
en fait, the US Constitution.
Il y a donc on sent que c'est quelque chose de parachuté, quelque chose de
They really feel their constitution, their law that has been imposed, you know, from somewhere else.
Le peuple, à travers les artistes, et ils critiquent ça. Ils disent, on critique, on dit, même sous forme de blague, même sous forme de comédie, on parle mal de ça pour montrer qu'il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas. Ça ne vient pas de nous.
And the voice of the artist is forcing the people, indeed, they even make joke about it, and they also sing about it, saying that this is wrong, you know, telling what is really happening, their voice.
Bien sûr, ça, en fin de compte, ça influence les décideurs, ça influence les faiseurs de loi, donc on a de plus en plus de lois adaptées aux réalités.
And eventually, it gets through, the message gets through to the politicians that will make laws that are a bit more corresponding to their real culture, their real situation.
I want to ask you, Reza, about one of the books that was on the screen before, which is War and Peace. Oftentimes we think of the work that photojournalists do as always being about poverty, suffering, war. Is it possible in a constructive way to image peace? And have you tried to do that in your work?
I'm glad you brought it up, because after all this works, more than 30 years with the media, I find somehow that I'm not part of the same group of the people. I'm not part of the same idea that make the big media in the world. I'm more looking for what I call the positive mind and the beauty of the life. Even if I'm in a war zone, if I'm in a conflict, even if I'm in refugee camps, my way always has been saying that what is it good for just to go and find the ugliest body that is composed or decomposed, or people that the houses that are destroyed? What is good for? Why media think that they should show this one and everybody's running to show this one? Why, if I can show the beauty of Afghan people, the beauty of the African cultures, not in any given moment, but in the middle of the war, suddenly I could create an empathy between those people, between the people that watching it, because I know how much for the people watching a dead body in a war zone is not. I mean, they don't want to. the press doesn't want to publish it, but showing what is in the eyes of the survivor, the tragedy of the war, what is, you see more in the eye of the survivor, people that survived the exposure than the people who were there. So all my works, even if I have been in the war zones, but I'm preaching the peace. Because being on the war zone, I see every day the real victims are starting from the children, come to the women, and then the soldiers, the generals, the military, they are not victims of the war. I mean, you know what I mean? They have their own way of the fighting. But what the people suffer, especially in these wars, there was a big change in the wars from the centuries back from the till now. Before, you had mainly the war was happening between the two militaries, armies, in the far away. Then the consequences were in the cities. Now, immediate attacks on the civilians. How many civilians have died? That's why I'm more trying to explain war plus peace. That's what I'm trying to. People, they have seen the casualty of the war. Now we have to move more to peace.
Before we ask you to contribute some questions, I want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask Roberto one last question. I write about architecture, and one of the striking things about your film is the way, because we get this very visual sense of the process through the justice system, that architecture functions in defining the relationship that people have to the rule of law with their trial. Can you tell us a little bit more just about those spaces?
Yes, and I think, well, we don't have the benefit of the images, but try to remember what the court looked like. And you'll remember that the defendant was standing behind bars in the courtroom. And actually, it's very interesting that the court system is attached to the prison system, architecturally. So, and I think ideologically as well. So punishment is the process of justice directly. In other countries, I guess in the United States, in Australia, and the UK, the prisons are separated from the courts physically. And it's a very different architecture. So we have this judges who are not present in the hearings, actually. And in my film, you get to see the judge, but you get to see the judge because we were taping. So the judge showed up. But according to data that we have from inmate surveys, usually judges are not present in hearings. And I think it's influenced by the architecture, because courtrooms in Mexico are designed to have two separate hearings from two distinct cases simultaneously. So obviously the judge cannot be present in both. Courts are designed to have just one defender rather than two, but they have two prosecutors. So the shape and the design of the courtrooms has a huge influence in due process outcomes. And one of the things that are changing dramatically in Mexico is that we're adopting an adversarial trial system now. And if you see pictures of those courtrooms, you would think you're in Denmark or in the US. They have the wooden benches and microphones and no longer attached, at least to the prisons in the way that you see in my film. So that is changing slowly, and I think to link back to the idea of having something positive in what you're portraying, what video allows you to do is to show evil, but then to show also how people react to evil. And that was very empowering. I think our film shows bad things about the justice system in Mexico, but also it gives people hope, because in the end, Tonio has a happy ending, and Tonio is released, and and we get to expose the police officer who puts him in jail unfairly. So that has a moral component to it that is uplifting, and I think that helped the film to get a huge audience. Whereas if you just show the decomposing body and the problem, and you don't show people how to change that reality, then you have a tiny audience.
I think we'll probably have a couple microphones, and with the lights on and ask if you would like to pose questions to the panelists. And there's a question here in the very front.
Thank you for that. My name is Jacques-Philippe from New York, renewable energy called Empowered. My question has to do with the interrelationship between art and crime. I think the panelists did a great job of talking about their ability to shed light on issues and have them be taken seriously. But when you think of art and artists generally, it's usually hard for them to sustain themselves and livelihoods. There's so many artists all over the world, and generally you meet an artist and they tell you they're an artist and you assume they're not making money. And it's funny, but crime is very much connected to means. And so one would guess that a large percentage of people who are committing crimes might be artists because they don't have money. And it's a means to an end. I don't believe that people are born criminals. They need to survive, and they may not have means. So perhaps you can speak to kind of that connection of how one sustains oneself, and also the fact that you're shedding light on the issue of crime.
I think artists are criminals in a way. Well, you end up having to break rules in order to be a dissident. I don't know if to sustain myself.
Sure.
But I can say that some of the most creative people I've met in prison. And so Tonio, for example, he's a rap artist, and he sings and he dances. But many of the people I met in the prison had that kind of artistic aspiration, and it's significant that I think some of the most creative people were there, and we're locking them up instead of giving them a chance to do something with that creativity. Because creative people find ways to survive and break rules and make a living, right? And when you don't have formal ways to engage people in your country and economy. So, for example, significantly, the young prison population has increased dramatically in Mexico as a result of the war on drugs. And selling drugs perhaps became one of the means that people resorted to in order to be able to survive in an economy that doesn't have enough opportunities for people. So that would be my reaction to that.
I just have a little confused about your explanation of the misery and poverty and the crime. I do have a different look into the misery and crime, because let's say in your, I mean, as you're a lot of justice people, in your way, we, between us, with journalists, we say, if you kill one person, the judge calls you martyr. If you kill many people, they call you serial killers. But if you kill more than 5,000, you are invited in Geneva to sign a peace treaty, and you are treated as you know what I mean? It's when you're talking about that's the reality of the world. You have to kill more than 5,000 people, so not be named criminal. You have to get your hand off the $100 million taking off the people's bank account and not being called a criminal. But if you steal $1, then everybody, all the judges and systems come after you and take you and show you, oh, look at this. While if you got like a corrupted president or minister that we all have, you know how many presidents and ministers and all over the world corrupted we have that has more than $50 million getting out of the, nobody called them criminals. So first of all, I would like to make sure that we are understanding what you're talking about, misery and criminal, and I don't want to really put the people in the poverty and the criminal in the two level. It is out of my, clear for people. The second is that, being criminal, maybe there are art also. Art, what is meaning exactly? Art meaning that using unusual ways that is seeing the thing that people doesn't see, explaining to them something. So maybe yes, some of the criminal, in a way that we talk about it, we have met in prisons or whatever, they are somehow, in what they're doing, we can say that they are artists because they use this kind of unusual way of looking. But going back to the prison, when I was in prison, in the Shah regime, then it was really full of the artists because we were all political prisoners, 5,000, imagine, and all the writers, philosophers, poets, filmmakers, the best of the best, the creme de la creme of the Iranian, at the time, society, they were in prison. And I was a 22 years old student. For me, it was like, God, I'm in university. The best writer, the best filmmakers, they are just here. I can talk to them. I can sit down with them for days. That was how I learned about it.
Dans notre cas, en tout cas, moi, je ne vois pas qu'il y a une propension particulière des artistes pour l'écrire, plus qu'un journaliste ou un chauffeur.
For him, it's the same. I mean, he doesn't see that the really artists are more acting criminally than anyone else.
Parce que ce soit un journaliste ou un chauffeur de bis, c'est-à-dire qu'un artiste pour moi, dans la société, on a les mêmes chances d'être un criminel qu'un journaliste ou un chauffeur ou un boulanger.
Living in society, you have as many opportunity to be a criminal as a journalist or minister or whoever.
Dans le cas de mon pays, il y a eu des jeunes qui se sont révoltés au nord, qui ont pris des armes pour dénoncer des situations politiques inacceptables. Il y a d'autres jeunes dans les rues de Bamako, aussi la capitale, qui se sont promenés dans la ville, qui ont manifesté, qui ont cassé des bâtiments officiels. Et parmi ces gens-là, on trouve toutes sortes de personnes, y compris des artistes et des non-artistes.
Yeah, when there was a rebellion in north of the country, the people that were in rebellion, people that took weapons, and in north, in the other part, they were going through the city and breaking things, etc. Because they just wanted to denounce the situation that was not that was bad.
C'est parce que c'était des gens qui étaient désespérés, ils n'avaient pas d'autre moyen d'expression que ça.
And they were all mixed people, of course. They were not only artists that were doing that. And that is just because they had no hope. The things had to change.
Moi, je pensais que seuls des artistes avaient même le moyen de s'exprimer à travers leur art que de s'exprimer par la violence.
Plus de chances to yeah. But they think that artists are more opportunity to express themselves and pass a message through the art instead of using violence. They are more pacifist.
Another question back there.
My name is May Gachlik. I focus on judicial reform in China, and I have seen quite a few trials in China. Every time at least they put judges on the bench to preside over the trials. Even though we all know that the real decisions could be made behind the scene. But that's why when I watched your film, I was actually very surprised. Why is the Mexican government not even interested in setting up a facade to put the judges presiding over them? What's the reason behind?
Why aren't they using art?
Because they don't have enough people as China.
That's exactly the best answer. I wouldn't know the answer to that. I guess the processes of justice were not visible at all. You know, the courts are geographically in the periphery of cities, so nobody has to see them. And then we have a very feeble media. When they report about due process, they usually just report an arrest, and they never report what happens after. And then they, you know, to their credit, they have very little access to the courts and the prisons. It was our film is the very first time that we got a camera all the way into the prisons and the tunnels, and it took us 100 days of filming in the courts and about 2.5 years of filming in the prisons in order to be able to make the film. So it took a lot of persistence to be able to show this. So I think the government doesn't have to do a big effort to hide this.
A follow-up question: why did she get the approval to do it?
I don't know. I guess I didn't actually have the approval to do this, given that's what's happening to me now. But I thought I did.
Maybe one last question, because we're getting to the top of the hour. There's right here.
Hi, Alejandro. Perhaps the artists have a very special way to really communicate to the masses in a very simple way, in a very compelling way. Can you talk a little bit about just some ways in which artists collaborate with other organizations, just doing interesting and powerful work on the ground, but perhaps do not necessarily have the means to communicate in such a powerful way as artists can do?
Chez nous, tous les grands artistes sont ambassadeurs de l'UNESCO ou de la FAO pour passer les messages de ces organisations.
In Mali, all the well-known artists are all ambassadors of the United Nations or UNESCO or something like that. So they have the means to
C'est parce
communicate.
qu'effectivement, c'est eux qui sont écoutés par les grandes masses.
Because a big massa is listening to them.
In the meantime, I think that some organizations that get to know before than others, and they come to the artists saying that, hey, we do have such a problem. What do you think that we could talk to the people, how we could bring it to the people? And you find always that, just one example, this mobile cinema project that I was showing to you, this was like UN, WHO, UNICEF, they all had a big problem, how to connect with the African women in the villages. And they were getting like proposal from big companies, communication agencies, from San Francisco to London to Paris for millions of dollars, in that, oh, we will go this and we will talk to the people, we'll print this one. And I was telling to them, hey, you print what? They don't read it. The women, they don't come on. But this very little film, 10 minutes films, going to the villages, showing to them, suddenly all this organization, they find that art could be a solution. Art could bring a totally different answer. And as I said, in many cases, the impact of this just films in the villages was much higher than anybody else you could imagine. That's how I think that all organizations somehow, they should think of, especially now that we have all this mass media, we have all this mass communication, is how image or, in a way, art could help solve some of the problem or bring, even sometimes bring questions up.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think once you realize you need art, which is the first big step, and I congratulate this forum for organizing this space and inviting us, because it seems like we don't fit in a place about the rule of law. But once you realize you need artists, and that there's a connection between art and the rule of law, then you know, supply it yourself. You know, don't be waiting for an artist to come and tell your story. I think anybody can be an artist, anybody can take a picture, anybody can tell a story, anybody can write a song, anybody can make a documentary. I had no training in documentary film, or photography, or art, or video editing, or film, before I made my film. And so it cost me a lot of effort to learn in order to do it, but I think anybody can. And so it's, we were talking on the phone a few days ago, and I told Philip that being an artist is a label that I kind of feel uncomfortable with. I'm a lawyer, I'm a policy analyst, I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, but I can make art, you know? And I think so can you, and so can anybody. And I think there's experiences to share so that that can be brought to fruition.
It's remarkable, thinking back to the conversation today, how many of the essential tools that artists are using are essentially like tools of civil society. It's about research and documentation and getting close to your material. There's a lot that goes on that isn't that actually is where art and magic happens. But the homework that artists do, especially perhaps artists who follow this kind of NGO style of art. The homework you're doing is exactly like what people who are not artists are doing when they approach the questions that all of you are thinking about. The other lesson from today is that we could have had an hour and a half one-on-one with all four of the people that we've heard from today. Maybe next time we'll have that. I want to thank our panelists, not just for being here, not just for their contributions, but because all three of them have put themselves in danger to do the work they do. It's not just sitting in a studio and coming up with beautiful things, but they're very close to the ground and they've run personal risk, and I think that's remarkable, so I'd like to applaud them.